Hello again. I welcome you to my next lecture. Today we are going to discuss the origin of Marxism. It's a very important topic. That is why we are going, in addition to this lecture today, we're going to do a discussion next class on Thursday, discussion on the same topic. Let me briefly introduce this broad topic, I would call it, and connect it, make link, draw the links between what we did last time and what we're going to do today. So last time we talked about so-called utopian socialists, again in quotation marks. The utopian socialists did not believe in the revolution, okay? People whom we are going to discuss today, they argued that whatever had been offered before in terms of socialist teachings, it was all mistaken perception. It was all mistaken assumption. So the gist of the teaching of people whom we're going to discuss today is their total breakdown of the contemporary society and the apology for the socialist revolution. So the people whom we are going to discuss today, they came to believe in the revolution. It's the way to completely, radically change the existing society. Okay. There are three persons we are going to discuss today. Okay. In terms of their significance, we can historical significance, we can grade them this way. First, Marxism, of course, is the expression associated with the name of Karl Marx, okay? Allegedly the founder of Marxism, okay? The second person, his friend and collaborator, we're going to discuss today, is Engels, a person which is known but less known than Marx, okay? And the third person, whom I'm sure you never heard, is Moses Hess, okay, who also contributed to the rise of so-called scientific socialism or Marxism. Okay, three persons. After we discuss these three persons, we will briefly address what novel things Marxian socialism introduced in this whole doctrine of socialism. Okay, because as you know, Marxian socialism is only part of this broad ideology called socialism. Although, I want to, jumping ahead, I want to stress that the Marxian socialism became one of the most influential trends in the socialist creed or in the socialist ideology. But I would like to start my conversation today not with Karl Marx, but by bringing to your attention the name, the third name. Okay, so we will go from the bottom and then we will talk about Karl Marx. So we will start with Moses Hess, because as Engels said, he converted me to communism. That's how he referred to the name of Moses Hess. The contribution of this person was so important that we cannot just skip it like all major books on Marxism and socialism do. Okay, and it's especially important in the conversation I'm going to have with you about this general conversation about the socialist creed as the form of political religion. So let us start with this person, the first communist, again, quote unquote, as he was referred by Engels. Moses Hess. Moses Hess was a German Jewish intellectual who lived in the, like Marx and Engels, in the 19th century, was active in the first half of the 19th century. He grew up in a traditional Jewish family. And in fact, his father entrusted the granddad of Hess with upbringing him. So he was exposed to the Talmudic lore, to the traditional Jewish lore. At the same time, at some point, he revolted against his grandfather, against his religious education. So he became an atheist. He wanted to get a secular education, and eventually he became interested in philosophy. He goes to a university, graduates from a university, becomes an intellectual, and he was very concerned about the problem of anti-Semitism in the German society. Okay, and he wanted somehow to resolve this problem for himself, for his fellow Jews as well. So he comes to believe that the way to resolve this problem is not isolation, like traditional Judaism did, to isolate themselves from so-called Gentiles. It was also not on the way of assimilation, total assimilation, and embracing this existing liberalism of German society. Moses Hess was coming to an assumption that the fate of the Jews and the plight of the Jews could be resolved through the social transformation of the existing society. He was coming to an assumption that without liberation, the rest of society, without liberation of so-called common people, working people, there would be no liberation of Jews. Okay. Nationalism, anti-Semitism would be eliminated when workers of all countries would rise up against the oppressive society. Modern society, oppressive society, would take power in their own hands. They will eliminate these ethnic national borders, and people like brothers and sisters would live in this cosmopolitan society, internationalist society. Okay, and that's how the problem of anti-Semitism would be resolved, and eventually the problem of oppression of the rest of society. See, that he was an internationalist. He believed that the problem of working class people could be resolved simultaneously with the resolution of the problem of Jews. So they go hand in hand. Okay. So he started to preach class struggle. Okay. He was saying that people in each society were divided into classes, and so-called bourgeoisie or middle class, that they came to dominate society in the wake of the French Revolution. Remember, we talked about utopian socialists who were also upset about this, that instead of feudal inequality, now economic inequality came to occupy this, came to become the central issue of society. So Hess was also concerned about this, and he said, in this society divided into classes, it was the duty of the working class people to revolt against their oppressors, unlike utopian socialists who simply argued that it was the state that had to do something good for the working class people, to do something good on behalf of the working class people. Okay. So Moses Hess was convinced that workers should make a revolution. And again, simultaneously, this revolution would liberate the Jews because with their ascent of working class society, when they take power, all oppression would be gone and ethnic contradictions would be gone, and this utopian paradise would prevail all over the world, when there would be no borders, ethnic borders, no national borders, and it will be brotherhood of people. Okay. So as a result of class struggle, working class people take over power, and he, at the same time, he was convinced that revolution should happen, but with the less violence as possible. So it's hard, of course, to reconcile how he could view it, but anyway, he tried to argue it because he understood that the revolution, as he said, was an unavoidable thing, but we should somehow minimize the violence. Okay. I would like to jump ahead and mention that in the 1850s, being exposed to German anti-Semitism, he comes to a pessimistic conclusion that despite his original conviction that all toiling people of the world, when they revolt or when they fight against this capitalism inequality, they already begin to treat each other as brothers and sisters. They are all united. They have no ethnic animosity toward each other. The experience of living in Germany convinced him that anti-Semitism was so widespread in the German society that he became pessimistic. So he comes to the conclusion that we as Jews, we will not be able, most probably, to resolve our issues within this international socialism. So that is why later, in the very early 1860s, he becomes pessimistic about this internationalist socialism, and he becomes a Zionist. So he comes to believe that Jews should go to Palestine, and that's where they should create their socialist state, in Palestine, showing to the rest of the people that how socialism could be organized in Israel. Okay, so that is why some people also call him the first Zionist or the first socialist Zionist, and we're going to talk more about socialist Zionism when we discuss so-called kibbutz at socialist settlements in the 20th century in Israel. So he was the first, he was the founding head of the socialist Zionism. So he became pessimistic about internationalism and more comes to embrace the Jewish nationalist cause, because he said, I see that we will not be able to find a common language within Germany, even with so-called common people, because we're judged on the basis of our racial origins. So we have to go to our historical motherland. Anyway, so that was the person who lived in Germany, then persecuted by Germanic princes. He traveled from one German state to another state, and he moves away from Germany. Again, Germany was divided in different kingdoms at that time, so it was not United States yet. So he moves to France in the 1830s, where he plugged himself into the socialist movement, French socialist movement, and he was a very important link. He was a very important link that connected French and German socialism. Okay. He begins to publish Rheinische Zeitung. Okay. It's a newspaper, socialist newspaper, trying to preach this elements of French socialism among German immigrants who lived in France, or smuggle some copies of this newspaper in Germanic kingdoms where socialism, socialist propaganda was forbidden. Okay. At some point, he befriends this man, Friedrich Engels, a German socialist who came from a family of rich parents. He grew up in a family of textile manufacturers. Remember, we talked about Industrial Revolution, this textile factories, okay, the first spearheads of Industrial Revolution. So he was born in the wealth. His father was a very rich textile manufacturer. In fact, he has factories in both in Germany and England, and eventually he sends his son, Frederick Engels, to Manchester to manage a few factories that belong to the family. And Engels successfully managed these factories. He was a very successful textile businessman who simultaneously was active in the socialist movement. Okay, so Frederick Engels was born in Düsseldorf area, and I would like to mention that Düsseldorf area historically was a very important area of evangelical movement in Germany, evangelical, so-called Germanic Great Awakening. There was a bunch of sects, agitated people who were preaching this apocalyptic notions of the end of the world, okay, who tried to spread the word among the people, okay. They should be holy, they should follow this apostolic lifestyle, going back to the roots of this humble origin of Christianity, again, preaching the end of the world. I just want to paint this background, cultural background in which Frederick Engels was born. And his family was extremely religious. His father was actually a very active evangelical lay preacher. Okay, we have to keep it in mind. Although personally Engels eventually became an atheist, and of course he hated religion, but we need to keep it in mind because it's important for us. So he was a very talented man. So he received a good high school, we would say, education. He went to a gymnasium, but he never graduated from a college. Okay, instead he enrolled into military service. But at the same time, being a very talented man, he mastered a few languages. He learned English, he learned French, he in fact wrote in English. Okay. He was very active in German Revolution, 1848. Okay. And his father was afraid that the son might get in trouble, so that is why he sends him to UK, to United Kingdom, thinking that he would settle down. So his job was to manage the family's factories, particularly in Manchester. Okay, so the article I gave you to read on the topic of Marxism, called Engels in Manchester by Gertrude Himmelfarb, is important in this respect, and I don't go into details. You will read on your own. Okay, so he travels to England. He successfully runs the textile factories. He produces wealth. They bring wealth to the family, but at the same time he doesn't give up on his socialism inclinations. Okay, so he befriends English socialists. But who were at that time the most popular English socialists? Of course, people who followed Robert Owen. Remember, we talked about Robert Owen. What did Robert Owen do in England when he came back after his New Harmony in Indiana failed, his utopian company? He goes back to England, and in addition to his successful, I would say, successful project of cooperative movement, remember that was his major contribution in contemporary social life of England, jumping start this cooperative movement. So he pioneered the co-op movement in England. In addition to this, he launched so-called the halls of science. Remember, a secular prayer houses where they preached socialism, where they performed Sunday services, atheistic Sunday services, preaching socialism, preaching science. And that's where Frederick Engels goes, okay? He goes to in Manchester to one of these halls of science. He even published a few articles in Owen's newsletter, in Owen's socialist newsletter, okay? But at the same time, he was upset with utopian socialism. What did upset him about the utopian socialism? He thought that it was too naive in being convinced that ruling classes could be persuaded to do something for the working class people. Okay. He was coming to a realization that something should be done actively. So he becomes an activist, radical activist. Okay. Like Owen Knights, he becomes a severe critic of religion. Okay. Since he was a German, he was exposed to so-called Hegelian philosophy. Hegelian philosophy, we have to briefly describe who Hegel was. Hegel was a German philosophy, the most popular, I would say, German philosophy in 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, especially these 3 decades. Okay, Wilhelm Hegel, professor of Berlin University, he argued that the history of the world, it's the development, evolution of the spirit. Okay, so the world spirit develops from elementary forms to higher forms, and society goes through dialectical development. I will give you a brief and clear description because Hegelian philosophy is pretty hard to embrace, and of course it's impossible to explain in 2 words. Okay, first we have this ideas, talking about Hegel. His ideas are based on this evolution of the world spirit. So there's an evolution from elementary forms to higher forms. Okay, so world spirit evolves in time, develops in time and space. How? It develops in a dialectical manner. Okay, like there is state of spirit or state of things. He called it thesis. Okay, and then in our society, everything develops through antithesis. So somebody begins to criticize existing state of things. Okay, so we have thesis, the state of things, and we have antithesis, and these 2 parts fight each other, and then we have synthesis. They produce synthesis. Okay, so the antithesis negates the original thesis, and then they produce synthesis. Okay, and that's how it goes on and on and on and on and on and on. Okay, so the best way to describe this development, think about a spiral. Okay, like this spiral. So our world develops according to this spiral. Okay, and we have contradictions, spiritual contradictions. Okay, so Wilhelm Hegel called it the spiritual development. Okay, but what Moses Hess, Engels, and subsequently Karl Marx did, they started to, and I did it already, instead of talking about spirit, they put society. Instead of spirit, they put society and the economic development of society. They said, hey, that's how our society develops. So we have contradictions in our society. Okay, so the world society and the new society, they fight each other. Working class people, proletarians, fight against capitalists, and eventually we move on. Okay, see, that's how they viewed development of society. And you will see later, I will address you in the course of this lecture. I will explain to you that Marx and Engels created the whole theory of socioeconomic formations based on this, okay? This development, this gradual evolution, okay? So Hegel was very important, and Engels was, before he even moved to England, he was part of Hegelian group, so-called young Hegelians, who tried to use Hegel for the radical critique of society, okay? Because Hegel personally, he was not a radical. He was a very conservative. In fact, he argued that even though our society develops in a spiral toward the progress, at some point it stops, and that would be the end of the world spirit. And he believed that what they had in Germany at that point, that was the ideal state of society, the ideal state of spirit. Okay, so the Prussian monarchy for him was the ideal state that manifested this world spirit. Okay, of course, for Engels it was ridiculous. For Moses Hess, who was also a Hegelian, Moses Hess was also a Hegelian, I forgot to say. So they belong to this movement of young Hegelians. At some point, Engels befriends Moses Hess. They become friends, and Moses Hess tells him, look, our society is divided in two groups. We have working class people that fight against the so-called capitalists. Okay, we have these contradictions. Okay, and most probably the future of the world is going to be the revolt, would be linked to the revolt of these so-called proletarians against capitalism, and that's how we will enter the future communist utopia. He called it communism. And Engels became interested in this. Okay, he was hooked on these ideas. And then Engels befriends Marx. Okay, who actually is considered the founder of Marxism. Okay, Marx, the most important man who actually is put on the pedestal compared to, in contrast to these two other guys, Moses Hess and Frederick Engels. Okay, but I purposely was kind of going from the bottom to the top. Okay. In fact, it was Frederick Engels that promoted the word Marxism. Okay, he was the founder, one of the founders who spearheaded Marxism. Okay, he introduced this expression, the scientific socialism. Okay, he befriends at some point Karl Marx, and together they decided to promote these ideas of class warfare, class war in contemporary society, these proletariats against capitalist manufacturers. Okay, and then Engels introduces Marx to Moses Hess, and three of them begin to work on the same project. They begin to argue that proletarian revolution of working class people against these manufacturers, this bourgeoisie, they use the word bourgeoisie. That was the way of the future. Okay, so three of them started working on this project. They called it later scientific socialism or Marxism. What captured Marx's imagination was a manuscript written by Engels. It was called Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy, 1844, where Engels argues, he outlines this rudiments of the future Marxist teaching. In this manuscript, he says that private property is evil, that capitalism destroys human bonds, it alienates people from each other, that a person becomes a slave, or factory slave, so people have to sell their labor to the factories. Okay, So we have concentration of wealth under capitalism, all right, and growing misery. So Engels and later Marx came to view society, contemporary society, where capitalists accumulated all the wealth, so-called 1%, and 99% lived in misery. And in fact, they viewed it this way. So we have more and more and more and more misery in society, okay? The further capitalism develops, the more poor people we have, because in their imagination, Engels and Marx, capitalists would accumulate so much wealth, you know, they become like vampires, okay? And eventually, the majority of society becomes miserable, 99%, and 1% becomes so rich, and that's when the society would be ripe for revolution. Of course, a very superficial view of society. They forget that this wealth is not zero-sum game, you know. The wealth is invested, the wealth is, the salaries are paid, there's a management, there's a bunch of small companies which also serve to these textile factories. It's a whole chain of small businesses, a chain of different managers, workers, suppliers, okay? And that's how this wealth exists in society, okay? Some people make more money, some people make less money, but if you look in economic development, there is no 1%, okay? But that's how they didn't view society in this way. So they believed that manufacturers became obsessed with production of items, selling them, and eventually we have a bunch of miserable people, underpaid, 99%. But on the other hand, we have a bunch of goods produced in society, and there is no one to buy these goods. And what we have crisis. That's how they viewed crisis. Economic crisis in their mind was happening in this way, when we have a very simplistic view, overproduction of goods and not enough people to buy them. And that's how we have crisis. So any economic crisis and later Great Depression of 1929, Marxists viewed in the same way. So it was overproduction. Look, they destroy milk, dropping into the sewage system, which happened, smashing apples and oranges, trying to keep prices up on them. You know, they thought that's what it was, overproduction, and that's what creates the crisis, because we don't have enough people to buy these goods, okay? And as a result of this crisis, we have anger, we have misery, and that's how revolution happens, okay? But it's a very, to some extent, it's a logical explanation, quote unquote, logical explanation, okay? And it builds, actually, it was building, this explanation was building on this gap, real gap that existed in the lifestyle between middle class and working class people who moved in cities. Remember, because compared to middle class, especially in early stages of the Industrial Revolution, people were upset about the long working day, 15 hours. So there was a huge gap between the living standards of middle class and the working class, and that's what was feeding these notions. So that's how their preaching became very popular, okay? So we are robbed by the rich people, and we are supposed to revolt, okay? Marx picks up what Engels had written before, and he builds up on what Engels had written before, okay? He also picks up another work written by Engels called The Conditions of the Working Class in England, okay? Where Engels, although he was a textile manufacturer, he exposed this miserable conditions of working class in England, lamenting this long working days, okay? Arguing that, oh, we rob them of a certain amount of money, we underpay them, eventually we have to resolve this issue somehow. How? We will not be able to convince all the textile manufacturing to give up their wealth, so that is why we need the revolution. So he, even though he was a textile manufacturer, he argued he was speaking in favor of the revolution. So it's a very interesting, again, phenomenon which we see throughout history to the present day, when extremely well-to-do people, they feel upset about the plight of the so-called common people, and they kind of defy the interests of their own. Okay, they either throw a lot of money supporting certain causes, left causes, or themselves try to put themselves in charge of these causes. So now we have, again, Engels was putting himself in charge of the socialist movement, Marxian socialism. Although personally, I would say Engels was a humble person. He was not a very aggressive. He was timid to some extent. Okay, and in fact, unlike Marx, who was a very charismatic, aggressive, energetic, Engels always enjoyed this, being a humble person, to be like a person who should stood in the shadow, and that's how their relationships developed. Okay, after Moses Hess started to evolve toward Zionism, or I would say socialist Zionism, of course, Marx and Engels denounced him. They said, oh, he became a nationalist. He is not an internationalist anymore. He is obsessed with this Jewish issues. It's not a good way to go. So that's how Engels and Marx created this duet. Two of them became friends, close friends, and they established these relationships in which Karl Marx was to be supreme, okay, and Engels was to be like a second person in this relationship. Okay, so Engels actually provided Marx with money. Okay, Marx never worked a regular job in his life. Okay, Engels established a special fund for him, sponsored Marx, and Marx constantly asked Engels to give him more money because he had a big family. Engels was unmarried. He never was married. He had a mistress, a working class mistress from Manchester. Okay, but Marx had a wife who was from a old aristocratic lineage called von Westphalen. Von Westphalen. It's a old Germanic lineage, but wasn't rich, just a noble blood, but no money. So he needed money, and he had a big family, very big family. Okay, he also at some point moves to England to be close to Engels, and Engels constantly had to provide him money. Okay, so Karl Marx uses what Engels had created before, wrote before, incorporates this into his work. Okay, Karl Marx originated from a family of rabbi. He belonged to an old rabbi lineage. Okay, his father converted from Judaism to Lutheran Church because at that time there was anti-Semitism in Germany, and his father was a lawyer. In order to practice law, he had to convert to Lutheranism, and his mother didn't do it right away, but later he also became a Lutheran. Okay. By the way, the first published work written by Karl Marx was also related to Jewish issues. Although, unlike Moses Hess, Karl Marx was not exposed to Judaism, since his parents didn't care too much. Plus, they made a point to convert from Judaism to Lutheranism. They, even before they converted to Lutheranism, they tried to play down this Judaism, didn't care too much. So anyway, Karl Marx was not raised in traditional Judaism. Okay, he knew that he was a Jew, and he was exposed to anti-Semitism, of course, but he was not introduced too much to Jewish law, Jewish religion. Still, he was also, I guess, concerned about anti-Semitism, and he writes this work. That was his first published work. Okay, I would like to emphasize that. It's called On the Jewish Question, 1844. I have to describe to you briefly what was the occasion, why he decided to write this work. At that time, there was a debate in Germany among radical socialists on the left. Okay, how to grant rights to the Jews or not, the same rights. Okay, and of course, many people on the left at that time agreed that Jews should be granted the same rights as Germans. Okay, but one person, Otto Bauer, who actually was friends with Marx, he was a philosopher who belonged to Young Hegelian group, he said, no, we cannot do it until Jews denounce their Jewish religion. They're so isolated, this centuries of anti-Semitism developed among them, this secluded psychology, the psychology of this fortress mentality, that they believe the whole world is against them. They're so insulated in their world of Judaism. So we have to make sure that they denounce the Judaism, and that's how, after they exposed to the liberal lifestyle, liberal law, okay, when they denounce the Judaism, that's when we can grant them equal rights. And Marx said, no, it's not correct. He writes this work where he says, we should not demand from Jews to denounce Judaism. It's not about Judaism, he writes in this article on the Jewish question. He says, it's about the economic system, the state of society we have right now. He actually, Marx says in this article that we have this Jewishness in our society. Okay, we have a bunch of Christians who also partake of this Jewishness in money making, in commercial activities. Okay, see what he says. I want to jump ahead a little bit. Later, he called these ethnic things he described here in this article capitalism, by neutral world capitalism. But at this point, he argues, he rebukes Otto Bauer, and he said, it's not about Jews, it's about Judeo-Christian, I would say. He didn't use this word, but again, the best way to describe what he tries to argue, he said, we have this Judeo-Christian system, okay, which encourages capitalism, encourages commerce. Okay, so he says that we need to eliminate this system, which is used by some Christians and Jews to make money, which is used by Jews and some Christians, some Jews and some Christians, to build up these factories, to exploit workers, okay, to use usury, okay, to put people in debt. And he labeled this practice Jewishness. Okay, see, it's kind of ethnically colored, but at the same time he tried to divert it from Jews by saying that the entire society, the most aggressive, this elements of society, so-called capitalists, they were using this to promote commerce and exploitation. Okay, so we should not be focused on Judaism. We should be focused on Judeo-Christian civilization, or capitalism. He called capitalism. That's what we should eliminate. Okay. A lot of people misunderstand this article. Since in this article he is a very anti-Semitic, he actually curses a bunch of ethnic slurs against Jews. For example, he writes, "What is the God of Jews? The God of Jews is money." Okay, but at the same time, next sentences he said, you can read it. It's on Google. You can Google it and read the article on your own. But at the same time, he said, but it's not only about Jews, it's about Christians who also, the capitalists, some of them capitalist Christians, and they also do the same thing. So it's not only about us Jews, it's about entire Judeo-Christian civilization, which is capitalistic. So let's eliminate the civilization, and instead we're going to have this communistic system. See, he doesn't make this conclusion yet, but he is already close in this article to making this conclusion, that as soon as we eliminate this society of exploitation, okay, we will move into this society of communism, where we will have no difference between Jews and non-Jews. See, so you can, if you read carefully, deeply this article, you will see that it was also addressing his own personal troubles or problems of being a Jew in anti-Semitic Germany, but at the same time, you can see here the sparks of his future system, okay? So no wonder, again, Marxian socialism was born as a part of Judeo-Christian civilization. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Again, see, Marx and Engels, the partnership of secularized Jew and secularized evangelical Engels, it's the best evidence how it was created, okay? He had a big ego, Marx, okay? And he was a good speaker. He had this charisma. When he entered a room, everybody was expected to listen to him. So that some people have this charismatic presence. So that's what Marx had. He had this charismatic personality, okay? He liked to dominate these collective discussions. And he was a very intolerant when somebody else tried to capture attention. It could be like a working class man, it could be like a colleague socialist. For example, there is an episode in the history of socialism when Marx and Engels didn't like a working class man who was a tailor, a German tailor whose name was Wilhelm Weitling, okay, W. Weitling, who called himself communist too. But he was die-hard Lutheran. He believed in original Christianity, that Jesus Christ was a humble man, fisherman, and German workers, proletarians should be like Jesus Christ, okay? So Weitling was one of the leaders of these socialist sects that emerged in the wake of this Great Awakening. Remember, we talked about Owen and other sects like Shakers, okay, Quakers. Some of them became very egalitarian during the period of Great Awakening. So Weitling was part of this half religious, half secular movement, which still was trapped into Christianity to some extent, okay? So he was preaching socialism, but at the same time, Weitling argued that I want to be a radical socialist, and he called himself a communist too, So it was not only Moses Hess. Moses Hess, of course, was the first secular communist, but Weitling was a religious communist, okay, a German immigrant worker who lived in, at first in Switzerland, then he lived in France, and he was a very charismatic person who wrote a book. I don't remember exact title. It's called something, The Catechism of a Working Man, something like this, where he unfolded these principles of the Christian communism, Weitling. And he had a big following among German immigrant workers in Switzerland and in Paris, okay? Weitling controlled, was very popular in this group of people called the League of the Just. The League of the Just. It was a group of Germanic artisans who came from different Germanic kingdoms, who kicked out or immigrated to Paris, Some of them lived in UK. They traveled back and forth. So they belong to the League of Just. And they preach this Christian communism, that there would be total equality among the people. Private property is evil. Everything should be nationalized, and all money should be equally distributed among the people. Okay, so the Christian Christian communism. And by the way, Weitling also argued that science is very important. Society should be organized scientifically. See, he picked up these ideas from contemporary utopian socialists, this obsession with science. He was a very influential man. So he comes to Brussels, where at that time Marx and Engels lived, okay, and where the center of League of the Just was located, because it was right in the middle between UK and France. And he came to befriend Marx and Engels, okay. He comes and he begins to talk like a charismatic man, but in the same room we have Marx, who also tried to talk. So we have this clash of two egos, okay. So Marx tried to dominate this group of people, League of Just, okay, who met together to discuss the strategy and tactics. And on the other hand, we have Wilhelm Weitling, a working class man, a self-educated man, okay. Interesting. A working class man, a tailor who educated himself, self-taught, okay. And Marx, who was an intellectual, I forgot to tell you that Marx actually graduated from the Bonn University, Bonn, okay. He also received a good gymnasium education when he was a kid. Then he became a student, received a good training in philosophy. He also was popular. He also participated in some discussions of young Hegelians. So eventually he defended we would say master thesis, okay, in philosophy. Then further he defends another one in philosophy. So he was an expert in ancient philosophy. That was his dissertation, the topic of his dissertation, ancient Greek philosophy. So a highly educated man, intellectual. So this intellectual man confronts artisan, a self-educated, self-taught man, a Germanic, Wilhelm Weitling. So two big egos, and eventually Marx was able to defeat him intellectually, to put him down. And Weitling literally was morally denounced, literally crashed, and he eventually had to emigrate where? To the United States. To do what? To jumpstart one of these communes. Remember, the United States, North America, was the favorite place to jumpstart these socialist or communistic communes. So Weitling also, since he had no room in Europe, because Marx literally ostracized him, his friends ostracized him, okay, morally crashed him, Weitling moved to the United States, and he launched one of the communes, and of course this commune fell apart, but he died in obscurity. Nobody knows about him. But it's an interesting episode from the history of socialism that tells us that Marx was a very domineering person. It's no wonder that he actually came to be the person with whom we associate the word of Marxism. That's what happens, that the aggressive, charismatic people who dominate the contemporary scene, political scene, cultural scene, they become known in history, and humble people are less known. So Engels was a humble man who promoted Marx. And in fact, Engels, who did not get college education, he felt a bit of insecurity. He always needed, that's what all the friends, they mentioned, he always needed a confirmation for his intellectual maturity. And that's what Marx provided him. He could confirm that, oh, you're a great intellectual, you're doing so well, And so it was really interesting relationship where this, again, I apologize for using this Freudian terms, where Marx was a domineering person, and Engels was to some extent this intellectual masochist, who enjoyed kind of occupying the secondary position, and Marx enjoyed occupying this domineering position. It satisfied both of them. Again, I'm using Freudian words, but just to describe this whole situation, to make it simple. Okay, but what I'm saying, it's not to diminish the contribution of Marx. He did contribute a lot. Okay, because especially he was a good speaker. Okay, plus together they developed both of them a document. They became like the catechism of communism, radical socialism. It's called Communist Manifesto. So look at this bullet point. Okay, bullet point. Communist Manifesto, 1847. It became the Bible of radical socialism, the most popular book. It's a small brochure written by Marx and Engels. Why was it written? I will answer this question in a couple of minutes. Okay, but just to introduce this book to you, I would like to stress that this book became the Bible of the radical socialism, which had been printed in millions of copies. In fact, after the Bible, it became the most popular book in the world. To my knowledge, it was translated in all imaginable and unimaginable languages, including some exotic languages like Mongolian language or I'm not sure about Lakota Indian language, but any kind of marginal, obscure language. At least I know that in Mongolia, they do have translation. So millions of copies, the second most popular book in history after the Bible. Okay, but why did they write this Communist Manifesto, and what did they say in this Communist Manifesto? After they defeated Weitling in this group of League of the Just, okay, the League of the Just accepted Marx and Engels as the new leaders, okay, and they asked them to write like a manifesto type of document, like a program of this group. Okay, and the original plan was to write what? To write a document that would be called the Communist Confession of Faith. See, very interesting. In fact, after Marx defeated Weitling, he was put in charge of he was put in charge formally. He came to occupy the position of leader of the Brussels branch of the League of the Just. Okay, and he even carried this religious title, strange as it may sound. So it sounded like this: the chair of the Brussels parish, the chair of the Brussels parish of the League of the Just. So see, we still have a bunch of religious terminology, although their organization of these artisans was becoming secular, but still it was tied to the original like Christian guild type organization, a lot of religious terminology. In the process of working on this program document, Engels suggested in one of his letters, let's label it a manifesto. Why do we need this religious talk? We hate religion. We are atheists essentially. So why do we need this? And that's how they come to this idea that to label this document as the Communist Manifesto. Communist Manifesto, it's a brief description where they show why and how contemporary society is a society of two classes. They fight against each other, and why this communist revolution is supposed to happen. And they also briefly, not much, briefly outline how society of the future should be organized. Okay, at the center of their preaching, so-called proletarians. The proletariat, it's the Marxist expression to describe industrial working class people, so people who work in factories. The bottom line of the Marxist teaching is the workers who come together to work at the factories, okay, hundreds and thousands of them working together, they develop this camaraderie, the sense of togetherness. Okay, they come together and they feel each other misery. Okay, they develop this working class consciousness, or they call it proletarian consciousness. So, which is a very militant consciousness. And here we, like organizers, we step in, we trigger them to revolt against existing society, and that's how revolution is done. See? So they create this working class people themselves, prerequisites for the communist revolution, but they themselves cannot do it. They need organizers, so we come and organize them for the socialist revolution. That's people from the League of Just. Okay, and what we establish eventually as a result of revolution would be the dictatorship of the proletariat. So proletariat, they are destined by history laws. See, that's a very important thing, which did not exist before. So they talked about historical laws, and I will explain to you in a few moments what it meant. See, they embraced this Enlightenment idea of historical laws, the idea of evolution. In the process of development, through history laws, society develops into capitalism. It's a natural stage in the human evolution. And at some point, this capitalism, society of capitalism, creates so-called proletarians, naturally, according to natural laws. And these proletarians come to work at the factories. So they develop this working class mindset, okay, explosive mindset. They work together. They feel this the sense of togetherness. And we come and it's a very explosive mix, and we throw the match, okay? We kind of ignite this mix, and that's how we produce the revolution. See, it's a very logical explanation for people who, some people who feel misery, okay, who work like 15 hours or 12 hours in a day. So that is why it became popular on the ground level, this type of preaching, okay? So we have class struggle that develops by laws of history, okay? At the center of Karl Marx and Engels' teaching is the so-called materialistic vision of history and contemporary life. So see, I drew the pyramid here to give you an idea how they viewed the world. They believed that so-called economic base throughout history, from the dawn of human society to the contemporary society, economic base developed, influenced, affected the evolution of society, okay? And under any circumstances, we have economic base conditioning the development of so-called superstructures. What is the superstructure? It's ideas, culture, political system, philosophy. So the world of ideas, the world of political movements, political system, culture, so art, everything, philosophy, religion. So all these things they labeled by the expression superstructure. So anyway, the superstructure, according to Marx and Engels, was defined by the economic basis. So economy, production, okay, whatever economically people do, the economic interests, this factory labor, desire to make money, desire to get money. So all the economic activities, that's what they labeled by the expression economic base, okay. So the base conditions defines the development of superstructure, okay. And that's how they came up with this theory of socioeconomic formations. And in fact, we already see in the Communist Manifesto the rudiments of this theory. So that's what I would like also to discuss with you, in addition to talking about this article by Himmelfarb, Engels in Manchester. We would like to discuss this common class. But briefly, I will tell you at this point the theory of socioeconomic formations. Marx and Engels built on the popular ideas of evolution. that were extremely popular at that time in their lifetime. You probably remember Charles Darwin also came up with the theory of evolution. So the society, natural world, human world evolved from elementary forms to sophisticated forms, and it always progressing from bad to better, and eventually to the progress, to like some kind of ideal state of society. Okay. Marx and Engels believed that at the dawn of human history, people lived in this communist paradise, tribal society, tribal paradise, when people were equal, but they were equal in poverty. Okay. People were poor but equal. In fact, Engels wrote a book where he glorified this tribal communism. This book is called The Origin of Family, Private Property, and the State. You can Google it. The origin of the family, private property, and the state. So where he romanticized, glorified the state of society, tribal communism, and he even picked up some tribal people who lived in his lifetime, like Iroquois Indians or some people, tribal societies in Africa or Polynesia, where he said, oh, these are people kind of delayed on the human evolution, but they're good because they preserve this remnants of communism. Okay, of course they have to be also dragged into capitalism, but still looking at these societies, we can judge how people had lived at the dawn of the humankind. See, that's the argument they tried to make. They said, if we look at, let's say, Lakota Indians or Iroquois Indians in the 19th century, we could see how our Stone Age ancestors had lived. That's basically what they said, okay? And in fact, they argued this. There was a book by American ethnologist called Lewis Henry Morgan. The book was called Ancient Society, published in 1856. So Marx picked up this book, okay? Marx picked up this book, made a very detailed synopsis of this book. The book by Lewis Henry Morgan, Ancient Society, a very detailed synopsis of the book to build up this theory of socioeconomic formations, okay? It's another interesting, neglected page from the history of Marxism, which, again, not widely known. Okay, so Marx makes a detailed synopsis of this book called Ancient Society by Lewis Henry Morgan, American ethnologist, who did research among Iroquois Indians. Okay, and he uses this book to build up this theory of socioeconomic formation. He said, look at the American Indians who live in our lifetime, and that's how our ancestors had lived. They had this primal communism. In fact, in this case, Engels used ideas of Marx to write his book, The Origin of Family, Private Property, and the State. Okay, so he picked up the synopsis composed by Marx and used it after Marx died to write his book, The Origin of Family, Private Property, and the State. So see, they did collaborate with each other. So they said, going back to the theory, the society lived at the dawn of its development in this primitive communism, a tribal communism, where everybody was equal, happy, but they were poor. They were poor. And that's what they said, so very important. At some point, somehow, see, they didn't explain, one class of people within this tribal society, where everybody was equal, begins to exploit the other part of society. It was an unavoidable evil, they said. So without one part of society exploiting the majority of society, there was no way to create material wealth. Okay, somehow in human history we have like tribal chiefs or some kind of elders monopolizing resources, okay, or forcing the rest of society to work for them, and eventually they destroy piece by piece this tribal society. Okay, and that's how the first class society comes to the picture. In fact, the scheme you see on the slide I showed to you, there's a missing element. Okay, there should be another box here between primitive communism or tribal society, and feudalism. Okay. Between feudalism and primitive communism, there should be another box, so keep it in mind. This box should be called slavery. Okay. Reason we don't see this box here is that Marx and Engels later became kind of vague about it. Okay. Because they said some societies did go through this stage. In Europe, for instance, in Europe, the next stage in human evolution after tribal communism, there was a stage of slavery. But if we look, for instance, in China or Middle East, okay, or Mongol Empire, we don't see this slavery being the dominant part of economy. We see a bunch of peasants who were in bondage. So that is why they talked about feudalism. Okay, there was a bit of vagueness, but primarily they used Europe. They used Europe to build up their theory of socioeconomic formations, and based on what European material they used and some whatever they learned from American materials about American Indians, okay, this book Ancient Society, they argued that, look, generally speaking, when society of primitive communism breaks up, it historically had been replaced by slavery, where for the first time in history we have two opposing classes, slaves and slaveholders, and one part of society exploits the other. It was evil, it was bad, but it was progressive compared to primitive communism. Why? Because of this unavoidable evil, we have material wealth being created. So society becomes richer, where one part of society forces another part to create material wealth. Okay? So that's a natural law. It's a very bad, but that's how society goes in its evolution. And then when this slavery stage exhausts its progressive potential, historically it had been replaced by another stage, more progressive, called feudalism. See, on the human scale of evolution. Under feudalism, we have two new classes, major classes, which oppose each other. It's feudal lords and peasants. Feudalism is a more progressive stage because the labor is more efficient at this point. So peasants are not, do not belong to lords. They cannot be sold, but they're in bondage. They are not allowed to leave their land estates. So they had to work for their landlords. Okay? It's a more efficient way of doing labor. But here landlords exploit the peasants. So society becomes more wealthier compared to society of slavery. So that's how they viewed it. It's a very schematic view of the world history. Okay? And that's when they said, look, in case of China, Middle East, we see that, yes, they had slavery, but it wasn't the dominant part of the economy, especially in China. It was based on feudalism. But basically they said, even in a small sense, in a big sense, every society had to go through all these stages. So anyway, next stage where everybody had to go through, it's feudalism. But the feudalism too, at certain point, had exhausted its progressive potential. So, and historically it became replaced by capitalism. Okay? And that's how we have these revolutions in our society. This glorious revolution in England that unleashed the forces of capitalism, that partially at least gave power to the middle class manufacturers, or the United States, where the total power was given to so-called capitalists, okay, or French Revolution, where power was given to capitalists. See, and the capitalism, which is a more progressive stage of development than feudalism, we have two more classes which oppose each other. Okay, which oppose to each other, and these two classes are capitalists and proletariat. See, that's a Marxist jargon. So capitalists, it's a Marxist jargon word to talk about so-called bourgeoisie or middle class people. Okay, manufacturers, it's a generic name, capitalist. Capitalists exploit so-called working class people. again, according to Marxist jargon, the industrial working class people who work at these textile factories, like industrial railroad or iron making plants or coal mines. They're called proletariat because they are industrial working class people. So it was unavoidable evil too, but it's a more progressive than feudalism. And that's what they argued. They said, look, capitalism is the last stage in the human history where people were to live this unhappy life. Okay, according to laws of history, the class that was exploited by capitalists eventually revolts and eliminates the capitalists who actually created this working class people. So what they said capitalism breeds its grave diggers. So then, according to natural laws, it's like a human evolution. See, it's a very kind of 19th century evolution view of the world. Okay, which to the present day some socialists still share this view. You know, people believe in this. Okay, so and they said that as a result of this revolution, there is a negation of the society of oppression, and people enter this paradise, the state of paradise, communism. They didn't specify too much how people would live under communism, but at the same time they said, so it was prehistory of humankind, okay, when they lived in the kingdom of necessity. And when they make a revolution, when they say goodbye to the world of capitalism, they enter the real history, the society of future, this golden paradise, the golden world of communism, okay? In this golden world of communism, people would live like brothers and sisters. Excuse me, there would be no exploitation. But at the same time, you can see something else stands between communism and capitalism, something else which Marx and Engels did not specify at that time. So later, Marxist theoreticians who could not simply jump from, make this leap from the world of capitalism to communism. They did try, but they realized that they couldn't eliminate quickly this survivals of capitalism, old society. They could not immediately jump in the world of communism, and they still saw that despite all the efforts, like in Soviet Russia and other societies, a few societies that in the first half of the 20th century tried communist revolution, they saw that they couldn't quickly eliminate the survivals of so-called world of oppression. Okay, to explain the situation, they introduced this new second definition of the word socialism. Again, Stalin, by the way, Stalin was the man, it started under Lenin, but Stalin coined the second meaning of the word socialism, okay, which I did not yet tell you before because I didn't want to confuse you, but now I want to bring it to your attention. So in the Soviet Union, the first society that tried the Marxian socialism, they realized that they couldn't completely eliminate money, they couldn't completely eliminate all the properties, so they had to deal with this, they call them survivals of the past. So the Stalin coined this a new concept. He said, between capitalism, the society of oppression, and the golden stage of communism, we have transitional stage called socialism. Okay, it's like a threshold. Like remember, Catholics talked about purgatory. It's the same way, in the same way Stalin viewed socialism. It's like a purgatory stage where, when communists would purge survivals of old society and would create the elements of the future. Okay, it's like a transitional stage. So that is why, to be specific, when we talk about the definitions of the expression socialism, we have to talk about two definitions. Okay, the second one was introduced after Marx and Engels died. So when that is why if you ask, what socialism is all about, we talk about two things. The first, socialism, of course, it's belief or faith in the public ownership of the means of production, okay, equality that is introduced through the administration of things, okay, because somebody has to do it on behalf of society. This utopian belief. And the second thing, it's a transitional stage between capitalism and communism. So the two meanings of the word socialism. So please don't forget about it. All right. If you look carefully at this concept and this theory of socioeconomic formations, what do you see here? You don't need to be a religious scholar. You see that it's a very much Judeo-Christian view of history. Okay. On the one hand, you have the fall. On the one hand, you have paradise. Okay. Eden. Okay. When society were kind of naked, tribal, okay, innocent. And then you have the fall, when society was falling. Okay. This stage, feudalism, capitalism, okay, stage of slavery, this unavoidable evil. Okay. And then you have what? Heaven, redemption, revolt, Armageddon. So working class people revolts, makes a revolution. As a result of this worldwide Armageddon, we make transition to the next stage. Okay, that we're leaping into the future, the golden communist future. Okay, so Eden, the fall, and ascent into heaven, or heavenly paradise on the earth. So the heavenly paradise was reimagined, revisited as the paradise on the earth. Okay, and it's, in fact, if you go deep into Christianity, I didn't talk much about this, you will see that in the Christian theology in Middle Ages there was the same vision. Take, for example, Joachim of Flor. It was a very popular theologian in early medieval times who talked about these three stages in development of society. Okay. See, all theologians, many theologians talked about it. Okay. So communist revolution was inevitable. Okay. The misery produced by capitalism, we have a society that reaches its climax, and then Armageddon happens. And this Armageddon, of course, they didn't use this word because they called themselves atheists. But despite the atheism, it was a profoundly kind of Judeo-Christian vision of the world. Okay, we have this Messiah, working class people, that comes to redeem the humankind. We have this Armageddon. We have revolution. And we have this social leap in society of future. Okay. Revolution would eliminate private property. Okay. And no longer will man have the means of exploiting another man, because everything would belong to everybody. See, what about the state? State had to exist, Marx and Engels said, but at the first stage of the human development. Okay, they didn't say about this first stage. It's later. Lenin, Stalin said this. But they said originally somehow we have to tolerate the state because we have to purge the resistance of old classes. See, they said there would be resistance, and the revolution destroys these people of property. The bourgeoisie would fight. Revolution might be violent because we have dictatorship of the proletariat. Proletariat would take over power. Okay, on behalf of the rest of society. See, the proletariat was the chosen people, the best of the best, like salt of the earth. They would take power and they would cleanse society, clean society from these dregs, from exploiters, from oppressors. And as a result of this cleansing, we would create this new society of the future. Okay, we weed out remaining capitalist elements. As I said, later Stalin perfected this vision by arguing that we have this transitional stage between capitalism and communism. So what we're doing, we're purging the old society. We're weeding society during this purgatory stage from the elements of the old society. It create the elements of the new. Okay, and that's how eventually we enter the communist utopia, when people would free to choose what kind of labor they would perform. They would be creative, productive. Okay, they would unleash their potential. And as I said, Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto and their subsequent works, they did not specify too much, unlike utopian socialists. They never specified too much how society would live under this golden communist future, in the golden communist utopia. They simply mentioned that it would be a society of free producers who would be united into free associations. Okay, but in the meantime, we have to tolerate the state, working class state, that would be working on behalf of the people. Okay. Now I want to finish this conversation by providing you this quotation from the Communist Manifesto, this vision, utopian vision, which Marx and Engels spelled out in their manifesto. Quote, "In communist society, nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch of wishes: to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic," unquote. So that's the furthest they went, trying to explain to us how the society of the future should be organized. It's a very strange vision. So they visualize this people of the future living this life of jacks of all trades, right? So when everybody would be changing each other occupations, when we would be philosophers, artisans, fishers, okay, politicians. It's an interesting vision of society. So it's, of course, up to you to judge, but that was the vision. And despite their, what they said, scientific view, they were typical utopians in this case. And by the way, the system they created, the system where they outlined socioeconomic formations, the system of society where two classes were fighting against each other under each socioeconomic formations. They called it scientific socialism. Why? Again, we will be talking more about it in our next class on Thursday. Okay. In the meantime, I invite you to read this article, Engels in Manchester, particular chapters from your textbooks, and browse your documents from the reader I gave to you. And we will talk more about the type of society Marx and Engels visualized in their vision of the would-be communist future. And particularly, we're interested in why they call the concept scientific communism. Okay, so why and how they tried to juxtapose what they created and what so-called utopian socialists had created. Okay, why they call the system Marx and Engels scientific socialism. Thank you for your attention. I will see